It's not the technology itself that drives change. Technology can enable something else that can drive the change. See how has the trend of centralization or decentralization evolved over that time period. Capitalism ends up being a great filter. Where the hope lies for me is in aligning profitability with values.
You have to be able to design that more decentralized system that where it can actually be profitable as an independent thing. True entrepreneurship is like you see a problem out there, you see something that just needs to be fixed or invented or created, and you're obsessing over it. When you can't measure it on a spreadsheet, it's about creativity, it's about solving certain problems and creating something beautiful in the world. It's art.
Hey, welcome back. So, Jordan, let's just jump straight back into it, part 2.
Let's do it.
What does a values-led capitalism mean to you?
I think that it means your values are driving your decision making, probably. Like even at like an organizational level, the way you make decisions and what you do is based upon your values. And I think that's really hard to do the larger an organization gets. And then you kind of have the principal agent problem in the managerial class that are running a lot of these companies. So that's how I would, like, at a very basic level, describe it. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I would agree with what you said there, but I'd like to kind of dig into what we mean by values, right? Because there's so many kind of classes of values there. And I think in economics, we have this idea of externalities, right? Things that, like the environment's a kind of classic example of this. If you're producing power, right, and you're burning coal, you're burning CO2, you're releasing CO2 and dumping that into the environment. And so the environment's an externality because it's something that is affected by your production, but you don't really bear any of the cost of that. You know, it's not affecting you in any way. It's external to you. And I think a lot of values, especially in Europe, which is what we're talking about today, in terms of European capitalism, focus on those externalities, right? It focuses on the environment. It focuses on, the negative effects of like the arms industry, for example. Things like that. But I think, I don't know. Would you add to that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, the way that I describe it is because I have spent and do spend a lot of time over in Europe and comparing the two systems, or I just say kind of how people are is the environmental thing is like almost like a religion, and it feels like a religion in Europe. And like I said, I think it's all it's all well placed and they're well meaning. But yeah, I think that's right. But I think, you just have a whole different system, right? So you have a place where people in general, the government plays a much larger role in your daily life. And the expectations from the population are that the government provides these specific services and quality of life. And so I think when you have that, you have a different approach to when it comes, I guess, innovation and creating new things and moving the world forward. I don't know, I guess you just have a different perspective on it, I guess, is where it lies for me.
Well, and I guess there's so many, these different types of values, right, really link into different ways European capitalism works, right? So we've got, you said one there, lifestyle. That's one set of values, right? You've got like health as part of that. You've got, I guess, a sense of mindfulness, right? A sense of peacefulness, physical noise, being quieter, I think is something that's valued. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And then you've got these kind of externalities that are painted out before. And, the European, to your point about the European government is very keen to address externalities with things like AI, right? They took great pride in being one of the first regions in the world to legislate on AI and have some pretty strong regulation there. So I think that was last year, right? Or maybe the year before.
It was right away. Not too far, it was pretty quick after the ChatGPT had its moment. Yeah, for
Right, exactly.
ChatGPT
Like
release,
ChatGPT
right?
3 came out, and then like a few months later, they were like, okay, this is what we're, this is how
Yeah.
we're going to regulate this. You know, and to
Well,
be fair,
listen.
there are some externalities in that. But yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
sorry to interrupt. I just think that, and this is kind of my position on it in general. Like, if you just don't get over intellectualize it, I mean, I think it's really easy. It's kind of like that quote from, I forgot who it was from. Is it Teddy Roosevelt? The quote about like the man in the arena, right? Where it's very easy for people to talk about the person in the arena trying things, doing things, trying to push things forward. And I feel
Mm.
like the European mindset and like their just general approaches, yeah, it's always easy to sit back and say, hey, let's take our time. Let's not work. Let's not like sacrifice other things in our life to work towards something that you believe in, or be careful of this new thing. We have to be mindful of it. And I think it's, like I said, another thing well placed, but it's always easy to do that. And I feel like, but yeah, someone's got to jump in and get their hands dirty and like be uncomfortable and like to change things.
And to deal with
And
messy reality, right?
totally. So I go back. I saw this great clip. I think it was an American guy. It came up like in my feed of, I don't know, about 6 months ago. American guy in Belgium. I think his girlfriend's Belgian. He was going on this rant, but it was like a very it was just very well spoken. Where he was like, you know, the European, like he was just going on this rant of like Europeans like are so quick to, you know, dismiss Americans and you know, say, hey, they're fat, unhealthy, they're dumb, they don't know what they're doing, like just very dismissive on many different levels, right? And he's like, but then
So
I'm
I'm
walking
laughing because
around.
this is literally the butt of every joke in the UK. But yeah, go ahead.
So like, but then, you know, he's like, and then I'm walking around and it's like, you're you're watching the iPhone and you're listening and you're watching the movies and listening to the music and the vast majority of what you're consuming is American on a daily basis. And he was also just saying there's just so many wonderful people, just like anywhere in the US. And I just think there's this, I don't want to say elitist because it's not really elitist, but it kind of comes across that way if you were to compare like the American versus European mindset. I don't know.
I guess kind of high and mighty, right? Like
What's
ivory
that?
tower vibes. High and mighty,
Totally.
maybe is a
Totally.
great way of putting it. And I think I really like what you said there about the man in the arena, because what it portrays is a sense of perfectionism that Europeans aim for. You can't do X thing until it's perfect and has perfect consequences. And of course, reality is never like that, right? Especially when we're living on a planet with a population of like 8 billion people, all of whom have got different relationships to different economic systems. Whenever you take X action, whether that's developing AI, whether that's creating some kind of regulation, you're always going to negatively and positively harm different people, different groups of people. And I find that part of the kind of European hesitancy to go in and build something, you know, it's not just kind of risk aversion, it's a feeling of, I don't want to accidentally, you know, rock the boat in a negative way until this solution is perfect. And so there's kind of like a nervous anticipation. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
No, I mean, it's exactly right. I think what you just said is very simple. Like doing anything new and taking real risk it's messy. It's in general in life. I mean, I don't know. In life, if you want to go after anything, this is personal, professional, like it can be on any aspect of life. Like, and you really want to go after it, it's all about what you put into it, and that's what creates the meaning for you. And so you have to sacrifice. And I think part of what I see here, specifically in France too, is I think a lot of the incentive to sacrifice is not there. So that's why many people don't actually even, they might have the idea or might be thinking about improving this or fixing this problem, but it's like the amount of red tape and administration and how long things take and just the way the whole system works, it's just kind of like beats them down a little bit, right? And at some point you're like, if I'm living in this thing, this whole system that's designed to make it very difficult to maneuver and try and do things. What's the point? At some level, right?
I think just to can I just go back to the meta-reality point, and then I want to go into the regulations. So with the meta-reality point, it is just true about life. You're 100% correct. There's this. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read into how the slave trade was eventually repealed in the British Empire. It's kind of an interesting topic, but there was this group of people called Quakers, which was kind of like a religious minority in the UK at the time and in the US, and they were very anti-slavery, right? And they were pushing this agenda for decades of trying to ban the slave trade. But they got to a point where essentially the only realistic path forward was that they were going to have to take a very uncomfortable decision, which was they would have to compensate the slave owners in order to free slaves within the British Empire. And that's difficult, right? Because you're rewarding the very people, you're financially rewarding the very people you're standing against. But they took it because they knew that that was the best interest of the slaves. That is a very great and very big example of meta-reality. Obviously, we're talking about things that are a bit smaller in scope in general, but that's the kind of tough decision making that I think Europeans don't consider when it comes to kind of big geopolitical topics of the day, especially with what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. And then so they end up just not participating. And I think this is a deep-rooted culture that descends into our economics as well. And then to go back to, economics, and you said about people aren't incentivized to go ahead and take risk and maybe invent something in an uncomfortable way. I'd love to just kind of hear more about that. I know in the UK, for example, you're always incentivized to be employed by somebody. And we've essentially got these three pillars of innovation in democratic Europe, right? We've got academia, entrepreneurship, and politics. And there's so many subtle ways in which you're directed away from entrepreneurship. If you want to rent a house, you usually have to pay for 12 months up front, right? Whereas if you're in a salaried position, you don't have to do that. And so these kind of like subtle things are kind of endemic to our shape our culture to be further away from entrepreneurship and innovation and closer towards, the 9 to 5.
So I'll say this. I agree with all of that 100%. I would say that I think also just to level set on the American side, that is kind of the case in the US too, which is very,
really?
And what I mean by that is I'll give you an example. It's basically the difference of living within the system or outside the system is really what you're getting at, right? And because we have such a very dynamic private sector when it comes to innovation, the private sector plays a much bigger role than in other Western countries, and specifically Europe, around innovation. It's still the same thing. So I'll give you an example. So if you're in the US, if you're a W-2 employee, which means you get a salary, just like you're saying, Reiss, versus if you have your own business and you don't take a salary, because salary is, salary, you get taxed the highest on salary, essentially. You could basically, in bigger cities in the US now, you're paying, up to, between all the taxes, about 50% on normal income.
And just to be clear, because the US is a federal system, you have the federal tax and you have like a kind of varied state tax on top of that, correct?
Exactly. Okay. So states like New York and California have substantial higher tax rates than states like Michigan, Florida, Texas, I believe, don't have any income tax rates at the state level. So exactly right.
Gotcha.
But it's interesting. So when you go, if you want to go get a mortgage or go get a loan or do anything inside the system, right? What they say to you, you go to Chase Bank, biggest bank of the world, the biggest banks of the world, and they say, okay, give me your W-2 like pay stub, which is your income, and then they run it through some system. No one pays attention to the situation. They just run it through some numbers, and they say, okay, you're approved or not approved. Now, if I came there and as an entrepreneur and I don't take a salary, I just take distributions, or I have I own real estate and I just take, I take distributions that are taxed at a very different, more advantageous level, or my salary is very low because it's the worst it's the highest tax rate, and then you take distributions at a different tax rate. They don't honor those distributions. They just look at your income.
Wow.
So
it's
you're
not even considered.
No, you're not bankable. You're not bankable. So I remember when I started Town Partners, the real estate company in Detroit. I mean, I was not bankable for like in the traditional system sense for like 6 years.
So what did you do?
Well, I didn't need. Well, I went all in buying real estate, and so I didn't need to get. I was paying 18-20% on loans and all types of crazy stuff, which we can discuss at a later time. But I worked outside the system. Like I didn't need a mortgage. I didn't need any of that stuff. So everything that I did, we did it in all cash, and I had investors behind what we were doing as well, and so. I was able to live outside the system. The long-winded way of going back to what you're saying is it kind of is the same thing in the US. You just have a much more, I would say, dynamic environment and more a cultural push that honors people that live outside the system and takes risks.
Yeah, I mean, what are some good ways in which Europe doesn't do that? And when I say good ways, good examples.
What do you mean? Doesn't do what exactly?
It doesn't enable people to live outside the system. I know, for example, in Norway, I think it's Norway, they have a kind of nationality number, and that is required to open everything: bank accounts, get a mortgage, get a job, everything. So if you don't have that number, you're completely screwed.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I guess the only prohibition against getting that number is being a citizen or not. But please go ahead.
This is like very interesting discussion, but let's get into it. So I can only speak from my experience because I have actually the lived experience in France. So I can't speak about other European countries, but it is 100% the case. Like you can't even, in Paris specifically, it's really hard to like even rent because there's a lot of demand for when an apartment comes for rent. Typically, you can't even rent an apartment if you don't have a job at a French company with the right paperwork or whatever it is to open a bank account. Oh my goodness. It's as a non-French national, man. The only reason why I was able to integrate some of that was because of my in-laws and everything are here. So they were able to help navigate and they had some relationships. It's the only way, right? For me.
Wow.
And then like to do it without so much friction. And one of the things, this is like, you'll appreciate this or not. So I remember I was transferring some money just for living expenses over to a French bank account. And the banker calls me and she's like, "What's that money for?"
She calls you?
Calls me. I'm like, "Excuse me? What do you mean? What is that money for?" It's my money and I'm transferring it to my personal account. Don't worry about what it's for. You know what I mean? And I was like, you take my money and then you lend that money to other people to make money on my money. That's how you work at a very basic level. So like, don't worry about that. Right. And so I'm just saying that is just another example of the differences in the systems. And this kind of goes back to the freedom piece where you just have a lot more administration, a lot more control, which is going back to this disincentivizing people to take the leap or to do different things or to just be entrepreneurial in general. Like it's interesting. There's a lot. I mean, we could go deep into this. As an American, when you're you come over to Europe and you start to try to operate in this system, you just have such a deep appreciation for how truly, like how much more free the freedom too, as you discussed, to do stuff is in the US.
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, I can't believe the banker called you. I've never been called by a banker, but maybe that's because I'm relatively small dice, but yeah, that's just shocking to me.
Well, I want to be clear.
Just
So
gonna
it's
take a
actually interesting.
Yeah,
You're
please,
saying,
please continue.
oh, sorry, the small dice or whatever. They don't they don't care about anyone other than like people with a ton of assets, right?
But it's interesting you say that, because I don't know, in the UK there's kind of a meme, right, which is that, if you misfile your taxes by like £1 million, the government's relatively lenient with you, right? But if you miss like £5, right, and they've noticed in your bank, then you're going to get punished and you're going to get massively fined.
It is totally true. I'm actually dealing with that right now with an audit on some small little thing that's been going on for 3 years for like nothing. I'm like a property that I own. It's exactly that. It's like, what are we doing here? Like it's endless hours by accountants and people from the IRS for like nothing, literally nothing.
It's a waste of government resources, I think, in these kinds of situations. And then we read about all of these tax scandals for the super wealthy, right? So it just feels needlessly punishing.
Yeah, it's different. It's just a different thing. And I said good and bad to each. Can I want to bring up something that I want to get your perspective on this.
Please,
Okay.
yeah. I have a few questions I want to deep dive related to this later, but let's switch track for now.
You want to go into that, and then because mine's a separate thing. Mine's a separate thing around values. So go ahead, and I'll make sure to write it down.
No, let's go. Let's continue with values, and then I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
This one, I want to see if you've had an experience with this, which is, so one of the reasons why the U.S. has such a strong global economy and obviously is the predominant global currency is because of the trust, the sophistication, the maturity, but more importantly, the trust in the financial markets, and more specifically when it comes to corporate culture and business. We have a very principled approach. I'm generalizing, of course, there's all types of shady stuff that goes on all the time, but very principled approach, and the court of law and contract law and stuff is very, very important in the US. So when it comes to business, Americans don't really operate with gray area, like in the gray area type concept, right? So have you had any experience on dealing with that in Europe around, great? I would just say when it comes to laws or doing the right thing or how things are done, there's a lot of gray area versus being very much more kind of right and wrong or black and white.
Yes, but I think the gray area. So for example, usually you can find the answers, right? But the gray area is in responsibility. So I'll just give you a small example, right? Let's say you need to come up with a data protection plan by law. There's something called, I think it's called the ICO. It's basically a government office. Deals with like digital and informational regulation, right? So if you've got like a bunch of users' data, you need to protect that in certain ways. You need to demonstrate that you've taken steps to protect that, and that's essentially it. But you only need to do that if you're within the threshold of like a certain size of organization, right? And you can dig into that, and sometimes you might need to call people, and you eventually get some answer. But everything is always like, it's 100% your responsibility if you get this wrong. And so there's kind of like a gray area there in terms of like liability, I would say, if you get something wrong with the regulation. Because there's always that like 5% doubt in your mind. Like, have I really got the right advice on this? And if I haven't, I'm going to get punished for it, right? Even though somebody else gave me this advice. So I don't know, there's that. And maybe that's just me, right? Being a little anxious perhaps. But I wouldn't say there's too many strong grey areas in terms of business. Where I would say there is a grey area is just in terms of the way the country works in general. So this is a bit higher level, and I don't think it's immediately relevant to economics. But for example, the UK doesn't have a written constitution. So whenever we have a prime minister, for example, Boris Johnson, who like pushes the boundaries a little bit with the way the system works, he's able to do that relatively freely, right? And so that can maybe sometimes, in theory, spook markets a little bit. In theory, is what I'm saying. I think I'm just trying to think of anything else related to that. Yeah, I would say that, but I feel like you had something in mind when you said grey area. So do you have an example?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, this is interesting because I think you were kind of talking like a higher level. This is kind of just on the ground, going back to kind of being in the arena or being inside of it, right? The realities versus what you read or you hear people talk about. And it's interesting. I had a long discussion with another American who spent a fair amount of time over in Europe and France and worked. I think he currently still works in France. And it's things that I've actually kind of experienced and felt in some of my experience. Not so dramatic, but this is what he said, which I found was fascinating. So he worked at a big telecom company in the US for like the majority of his career. He was kind of like in mid-level management and with sales, or I don't remember, some sort of business development sales. And what he was saying was, obviously, especially there at that level and at a company like that, it's like everything is, like he said, there's contracts, there's how your teams work. Of course, there's always office politics, and that's just the reality of anything. But it was very much like there's right and wrong. Basically, there's right and wrong. There's right ways to do things, wrong ways to do things. And there's like a chain of command a little bit, and just principled. That's all I'll just say. It's like, that's how it is. Generally.
But that seems to be at like kind of like the cultural level, right? As opposed
to correct. But that's driven because we do have a very like defined and good court of law when it comes to business law, right? And enforcing contracts and these things like that. And I can't comment on like the formal legal systems over here, but he was just saying that he worked at two companies here, like kind of, and he said in both situations, which was pretty interesting, he was like, I just saw specific things done by management that were just completely wrong and completely just like not principled. And but it's because they just kind of operate in this gray area. And
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So because essentially it's hard to drill into it. It's kind of like if you compare the two systems, like it's like, because if you're talking about a topic, the actual, like, they're like, well, we don't really like, the law can be interpreted a variety of ways, or you can interpret this a variety of ways. And it's depending on who you know. It's kind of like if you need an approval, right, from a regulatory agency, or you need something that has to do with like having a relationship, right? In the US, you have a much more defined process to do any of this stuff generally. I'm not saying it's good, it's efficient, but there's typically a process. Here, it's much more not as documented, I would just say, not as clear. Okay. And I'll give you the example. This isn't at a business level, but when it was funny when we had our first child, we had to go. We had her over in France. She was born in France, and we went to go get a U.S. passport. Right. So I was like, okay. So I went online, and it was so American. It was like very clear, great UI UX on Somewhat, do you have a child born overseas? Yes. Do you need a passport? Yes. Okay, here are all the steps. Boom, 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 boom. So you follow all the steps, you fill all the stuff out, you go to the embassy in the US, you get your passport. Right? And when I was getting like a long-term visa, the rules here, it was like changing every 6 months. It wasn't literally not documented on a website anywhere. And you would get three different stories So you need to hire a lawyer. You have to hire to go through whatever process. So that's kind of how I would describe the differences. And I think that has really big ramifications on just how people operate. And this is the reason why I'm bringing this up, is it goes back to values for me. When you have a less defined process, you have those things that are less defined. You know what that is? What that is a way for the people that have connections and power to maintain that control and to maintain that power, because it's by design, right? Like, it's very by design when those decisions are made, to have things not be very clear and direct.
I'd agree with that. Or sometimes it's not even by design. Sometimes it's just, things are working for us as they are right now, relatively speaking. So why change it, right? I think just there's so much in what you said there. I think the UK is perhaps an exception, because I've heard the same issue in Germany, where essentially if you want to get anything done there, you have to go through a very complex, conversational-based way of adhering to some regulation, right? For example, if you want to get a visa, it's a bit tricky. And then you have to email the right people, and then you have to wait for the correct opening times, right? So I guess in that sense, it's fuzzy. I would perhaps use the word fuzzy than grey, and unclear and vague and miasmic. I think in the UK, it's a bit different. I would say if anyone is interested in accessible UI UX, just to go back to your point, the uk.gov is an incredible website. Check it out. Oh no, gov.uk, that'll be it. But it's awesome. And there it's very much similar to the American system of step by step by step. This is exactly what you need to do. This is exactly what you need to be aware of. Unless you're going on these very, very specific regulations, like I mentioned earlier, with kind of the informational regulations, which is hosted on a separate website, you don't really have too many issues. That tends to be quite clear. I think the bit you mentioned about kind of office politics, right, and people doing bad stuff and then them just essentially getting away with it. I've seen that a lot, and I think in the UK, and I think why that happens is people are much more resistant to the idea of litigation in Europe, right? I think US is a very litigious society. So if somebody thinks they've been wronged, they will go ahead and take it to court, right? Much more likely. No one's doing that in the UK, because there's a perception of, of cost, right? People earn a lot less in the UK comparatively. I think that it comes back to risk aversion as well. What do I stand to gain versus what do I stand to lose? Well, people in Europe tend to overestimate what they stand to lose a lot, right? And they tend to grip onto what they already have than what they might get in the future. So, yeah, I think that speaks to the driver behind that culture of the grey area or the vague area, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I think so. On that point, and because to kind of wrap this together, I was just writing a couple notes here, and it's not fully thought out, but let me take a stab at it, okay? Because we this whole started with values-based capitalism, right? And the whole idea is, the assumption is, because of, like as you mentioned, the European way is a much more values-based approach. They think about externalities, they think about the planet, they think about the society in a much more less individualistic way, let's say, right?
Right.
And so the way that I kind of break it down is I actually look at, there's kind of two types of values. So on one level, I would agree with that completely, where it's like the value system in Europe around like what should I spend my time working on and what does society generally value is typically, I would say that it's definitely less about just making a quick buck or making money. It's about actually working on something worth working on. So in that case, I would say that the European system, when you speak to people, like when you speak to Europeans and you tell them what you're working on, like if it's kind of this, I'm just using another example, right? Like a calendar app piece of software or whatever, and they'll be like, we don't care about that, But if it's something where you're like, I'm working on, I have this new technology working on how to treat water to make it or to treat groundwater, to make it much more usable, or whatever it might be, something like really, really like meaningful to society and to them, they'll have a completely different reaction to that. Right. So I would say that, so I would say on that end, like I'm totally more aligned with the European system at a personal level on that. Now let's get to values around. So the values around what to work on, but then let's get the values inside of how the sausage is actually made. And I would actually say it's the opposite, where the US system is way more aligned with at least with my values. And you think of values, values led capitalism, where it's like, there's kind of more of this right or wrong. There's more of this, when you say you do something, you do it, versus much more of this gray area, or using because you have certain relationships or something to do some things that probably shouldn't be done, whatever you want to say. So that's how I would kind of describe it.
Yeah. So it's essentially values of the process, and then values in terms of the end goal, means and ends at the end of the day.
Totally.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think, speaking of ends, something I'd like to kind of move on to is the idea of government-led capitalism versus consumer-led capitalism. And I would say, the US is much more consumer-led, and Europe is probably more government-led. And in some ways, that's necessary. If you want to have a more values-driven economy, you want to incentivize people to work on those values, you've got the cultural element, which I'd love to go into in more detail in a minute. But you've also got, essentially, let's set up some incentivized structures by the government to financially incentivize people to work on stuff that's meaningful. And then that's where you get things like grants, and it's where you get kind of government-backed startup accelerators, that kind of thing. Yeah, and I just would love to kind of hear your thoughts on that, and hear more about, just how deep does that go? How necessary is it for a values-led economy?
What specifically? Sorry, I didn't really follow the actual question.
No, the question is, to what degree is being government-led required to have a values-led economy?
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, in other words, if we were to build a decentralized economy, can we get away? Can we have values baked in there without, having the government involved in some way?
I think it's just like, I think it's very simple, man. I mean, it's simple, but it's super complicated. But the simple explanation to me is it just comes down to incentive structure. So they always, like, the American view of this, which is like, it's the job of the government to fund and create whatever is important for what they believe is important for society, and to move the society and economy forward. They should do what they need to do, both financially, from a policy standpoint, to jumpstart the private markets and get the private market to take over.
Right. NASA's a good example of this, right?
In what way? Of how they did that?
Yeah, in terms of how they did that with commercial launch capacity.
Yeah.
They set up. Yeah.
Well, some people would say that it was not very efficient, but I'm not well educated enough on that topic. I know you dig into it much more.
I'm kind of curious. Yeah, I'm curious who would say that, but let's move on, and then we can dig into that another time.
So I think that's just the simplest way to describe that for me is it's just the incentive. That's if you want a values led, I guess, system, right? The government has to have industrial policies and incentives, and where industrial policy, and then provide funding and whatever it might be, so the incentive structure is aligned with the outcomes that they want to see.
So, I mean, that's very much what we've got today to a degree, right? But we would essentially need the government to do that in a way that is also aligned with decentralized values, essentially.
Well, oh man, we hit on an interesting one, which is like a core aspect of the whole MAGA movement in the U.S., right? Which is the what you're getting at is exactly right in theory, but the reality of it is the economy, and it moves faster and faster, but the economy is largely run, we talked about this before, but largely by middlemen and layers of middlemen and financial engineering in all different forms. And so the problem is not necessarily what the government's doing. It's kind of how the private actors and how extractive many of the private actors are along the way, which then the benefits don't come down to Main Street and to the middle class and the average person. So
Main Street is a very American term. What does that mean?
You don't. I thought you guys didn't use it when you talk about high street. There's high street in the UK. You don't use like high street and Main Street.
A high street is like where all the shops are. Is that what Main Street is?
No. So sorry. So in the US, they talk about Wall Street and Main Street. Wall Street is Wall Street in New York and financial engineering and big finance, and Main Street is, it's just the average American, and then you can say middle America, the average family. So,
gotcha. Okay, that makes
sense. And I think this wraps to what you were trying to say, which is this whole decentralization theme, right? So, which is like the whole core is like, if you can decentralize many different aspects of the real economy, with production being the first kind of the core or the heart of that, it's like when you do that, the idea is you reorient your systems of production, distribution, and then obviously consumption. And then the idea is you remove these layers of middlemen, right? So the idea is like, if you think about it, this is why the value always accrues to the person selling the thing or the person making the thing. And right now, the way that many aspects, at least in the US, everywhere, not just the US, but it's exacerbated in the US, is there's so many middlemen in between.
Right, we spoke about this before. You've got the distributors in the middle. You've also got essentially a bunch of services that facilitate, in quotation marks, these transactions.
Yeah, you have distributors, you have brokers, you have you have, especially if it's coming overseas, you have importers, you have distributors, you have brokers, and then you have all these. So it's like you can have 3, 4, 5 layers, in between.
Each of which are taking a profit margin, right, which inflates the cost over time.
Right, and not only that, you have, and then what's happened is a lot of the middlemen, they've just accrued so much power, or they're essentially aligned with certain actors in whatever market. And so they've just accrued so much market power that they just control these markets, right? It's kind of like I remember we discussed this. You actually introduced me to this term, which was monopsony originally. And I got really interested in it, and the monopsony being when there's only kind of 1 or 2 main buyers in a market, the opposite of monopoly. And that's actually that in many different markets, like, in the real economy, that is the case. When you're talking about inputs and components and things like that.
So I think when we first used that term, we were talking about the seaweed industry, right? There's really just 1 or 2 big buyers, mostly in China, that do this. But are there any kind of examples that you could tell our audience about?
Oh man, I could I could go on and on. I think I would say that it's not 1 or 2, but it's in many of the industries that I've looked into, but it's a very small percentage of buyers. So let's use a simple example. In the US, if you are making, a food product, a consumer packaged good, or a product that you want to sell at a supermarket, right? You essentially, you have some regional chains or whatever, but you essentially have a handful of like large national chains, right?
Right.
And those large national chains, you don't even sell to them. They make you go through 2 or 3 distributors. Like they force you to go through to the distributors. And so if this is like a really big problem for a lot of smaller suppliers, and this is a whole conversation of I think, a big reason why our food system is full of crap and poison in the US. But it is, because of how the system works, it's really, really hard for emerging suppliers to get into large, like supermarkets, large scale supermarkets, between payment terms, how the distributors work. Obviously, margins is always a concern. And that's why you have a bunch of industrialized shitty food everywhere. Because that's how the system works. Because it's based upon how the distribution system was built 60, 70 years ago.
Right.
So my point is, it's like, if you want distribution of your thing, you have like a handful of people who have real distribution. Of course, you can get small distribution, smaller, regional, and you can self-distribute. But if you want actual distribution where the vast majority of consumer spend goes.
Yeah. And so a decentralized economy would basically, like, you break apart the supermarkets into localized regions, do the same with distributors, and then and in fact you do away with the distributors, and then the suppliers just directly sell to these localized supermarkets. That would be the dream, right?
Well, you hit up a really interesting piece, Reiss, which is, so the function of wholesale distribution has existed ever since, ancient times, when initial trading routes were created, right? Because right. Distributors will never go away because they provide a lot of value, which is they allow the person making the thing to just focus on making the best thing that they make, and they provide convenience and everything for the buyer. So I don't believe that wholesale distribution goes away. I just think the function changes, to your point, where, similar to what's happened on the internet and many online marketplaces, where it's essentially a network, right? It's a functions like a network. You have buyers and you have suppliers, and it's a network. I actually think, and I get really excited about this, is how do you turn more and more of these industries and supply chains in the real economy that function much more like a network, versus a gatekeeper who stands in between the person making the thing and the person buying the thing. So that's how the distribution model works right now, where it's like, if I'm a distributor, like, let's just run it out, right? I'm a distributor and you make, I don't know, you make cups. I don't know, I'm just making it up. You make cups. I'm a distributor because I have the customer relationships. You don't have the customer relationships. You make the cups. And so what ends up happening for a lot of emerging companies, small companies, startups, is if they work through distributors, they don't know who their customers are. They don't actually have contacts with their customers.
Right. So they're getting really limited feedback even to innovate as well.
That's exactly right. So I tell people all the time, where it's like, so basically what it's turned into, just like many parts of the economy, that I keep going back to CPG and food because I've looked into this a lot, which is like, this is why, unless you have insane growth, like, and you're just a breakout product in a category, so it's kind of going back to this winner takes all thing, like, you can't survive in traditional retail.
Okay.
And dude, think about this.
Please continue.
Sorry, now you got me on my soapbox. So you got to remember this. This is an interesting thing, which is obviously with the whole creator economy, the role of, the whole big push with D2C and all that stuff. That is created a huge change with how consumers connect direct, or how consumers purchase and discover brands and who they trust. And there's a whole huge big shift going there. But I need to kind of level set on it, which is, but if you look at the numbers, I think I don't want to misspeak, but I think it's 80% of all retail spend in the US is still in or global, I think actually, is still in bricks and mortar. So what ends up happening is, even if you go direct to your customer, I'm talking about the consumer space more, or it could be B2B, but specifically consumer. If you go direct, the problem is, on that model, 80% of the spend still happens in traditional retail. So if you sell, a portfolio of bio-based lubricants or something, things like WD-40 and engine oils and all this other stuff, where it's like,
that kind of lubricants. Yeah,
that kind of lubricants. I'm just saying that because it's someone very close to me that's doing that. So, and I see it. And if you crack the code of going direct but at some point you're like, in the US, it's like, okay, but you got to go through Home Depot. You got to go through Do It Best. You got to go through Amazon. Obviously it's an online storefront, but still you have to go through these because that's where the actual consumer is.
Is that really true? 80% of consumer spend is in bricks and mortar still?
I'm going to double check it. I think
that is shocking to me. I'm really shocked by that, because all we hear in the UK is like how the high street is dying because nobody wants to spend money inside a store anymore.
Yeah, this is saying only 16% is online. 16% it's between 80 and 90%, online. I remember. I've done a bunch
wild. Why do we think that is? Are Americans just a lot more, I want to go and pick it up from the store today, that kind of thing? Is it, is it more gun-ho?
It'd be interesting. I think it's probably it's probably higher in Europe, man. It'd be interesting to look at that.
Well, I think it depends, because let's find out. UK, where is UK consumer spending? If I don't find it today, we can put it in the show notes. But yeah,
I'm gonna do a global real quick. I have the numbers. I have graphs and stuff. I just don't have it in front of me. Okay, here we go. This is globally. This is from Statista. Okay. Estimates about 80% are 79 to 80% are still physical stores. So 80% globally.
I found something for the UK. Oh, okay. I'm gonna find this whilst you keep talking.
Oh, no, it's a so it's 80%. So to answer your question is, yeah, I mean, I think it matters what type of purchase you're talking about, right? So if you have a commoditized purchase that people don't need to think, there's no consideration. It's kind of like a utility in their lives. It's probably a much higher percentage of online, but when you're talking about something you need to try on, when you're talking about a high consideration purchase, you need to go touch it and feel it and test it. It's a totally different thing. And at the end of the day, I think it's just like anything. It's like, and there's this whole thing in the US where Gen Zers now they're talking about, it's like the comeback of like the mall, the physical mall. And for them, what that means is like they've been raised. Your generation has been raised.
I know. I might look a bit old, but I promise I don't. Yeah.
Your generation's been raised like in front of a screen and for all social interactions and like at a very young age. And so there's this thing where they go back to like what's human. They're kind of like, there's just all bunch of reports on this. They're kind of like, they're yearning for how to make other real life connections. And I think shopping and that process is just one way to do that,
This is goes back as well to the whole retro trend of people buying, dumb phones from like 2006 and, retro cameras as well, right? It's kind of all part of the same trend. I think part of it's aesthetic as well, which I find really weird. I was at a mall in Thailand and there's this whole shop that's just 2000s, like noughties era aesthetics. And I was like, this is, because I'm definitely kind of in the older category of Gen Z, right? Because I didn't really grow up with screens too much. I think that started to become more of a thing when I was a teenager, like a young teenager. But it was just weird to see people like fetishizing, 2000s era aesthetics on their, bags and things. So that was odd. I think just to close out, I had a question here. Let me just find out about startups, right? I know you've got a hard stop, so we can continue this another time if you prefer.
I got a few more minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. So if we have a values-led economy, does that make our businesses that we build less economically sustainable in the long term? And maybe I can just expound on that a little whilst you think. I know of so many businesses, or when I say businesses, I really mean startups, right, in the UK that will focus intensely on, let's say bio-based lubricants, right? But they're doing that for climate-based issues, let's say. And because they're doing it for climate-based issues, that kind of comes first and foremost. They become so aggressive about that climate trumps everything else, including profitability, including generating revenue, including what the customer wants. And they try to find ways to kind of shoehorn their beliefs into solving those problems. So like if the customer's like, I really don't like the lubricant, this is terrible, this is nothing like WD-40, then instead of like adapting the products, they'll say, okay, we just need to like emphasize the sustainability factor more, right? And that doesn't really work, and eventually the startup collapses and fails because along with any potential positive impacts with it. So I'm curious if this is something you've seen as well in Europe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I would. Yeah, I mean, everything you said is true. I think it's just basic. It's just basic where it's like I can't tell someone what everyone finds meaningful work their own ways, and they want to work on things that are meaningful to them or that they care about. And going back to the kind of climate trumps all example, it's like, okay, it's very simple. Like if you have this belief in the product or the thing that you're creating, and that's your approach, and it's like, then you got to go find a market for it. And is there a market for it or not? And like what you just said, like that playbook just doesn't work. Like people can continue to do it. And I think there's no harm. I think it's wonderful, right? They're trying to work on a problem that's important, or an environmental problem. And I think but you got to build differently. You got to put, capital together differently. You need different supporters. And I think what happened was you had this huge rush of, what I would call fake VC dollars coming in a whole generation of basically entrepreneurs, where it's like this concept of like pre-seed, seed plus, seed extension, seed plus plus. Like it's like a joke. For me, it's a joke. It's like, what are you talking about? And so
all it is just a way of maintaining the status quo of the company when it's doomed to fail anyway.
Yeah, and it's like, but what ended up happening was because we had ZERP, and there was just everyone that jumped into everyone that just jumped in to say, I have a VC fund. They're investing in companies that aren't truly technology companies, that can't go up the J curve, but they have a fund structure, and they told their LP something that is just not true. So the fund managers were funding all this stuff, which gave this perspective from the founders. Oh, there's a whole market for this. Let's continue to do this. That's largely been corrected. So I just think that all plays out. The markets will like just flush that out.
And I think, that's where a lot of Europeans get wrong, unfortunately, is they don't understand that the VC game goes back to valuation. And it goes back. I find that so many European founders get kind of confused a little bit about what VCs really care about, right? And they think, it's all about, if I'm building a business, a lot of first-time founders, I should say, if I'm building a business, it's all about kind of profitability, and they'll, but they also really care about values. So then they run with values first and then profitability second. And they don't even consider what the incentives are for the VCs who are backing them, really. And then they get kind of confused when it's not seen as a reliable market indicator, right? Your investors are never a good market indicator. Your customers are.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think to close it out, I just think that when I look at the European system, so there's two things. Like I don't necessarily think it's naive.
I was resisting saying naive, but it feels like the right word to me.
It feels like a little naive, but it also feels like this is the reality. Like the reality is the majority of high agency people that are working on interesting things, and if they need to go get into that innovation economy and ecosystem, and they have something and they start in here and they get some traction. I mean, I've seen it. I've had many conversations. A lot of them pick up and go to the US as quick as possible because that's where the ecosystem is, right? Especially if the founders are like, they have a background where they might not come from money. They might not have a comfortable background. I've seen a very high correlation with founders here that, a lot of time, the ones that are here, stay here, it's like they have a certain type of background. I might come from a certain type of family with resources, and they went to the big school and
the aristocratic usually.
Yeah, I had someone. I won't name names because, but someone who's deep in the startup ecosystems, like, yeah, it's kind of like entrepreneurship is like a game for the rich people here, and so
Yeah,
I thought that was
so
like
true.
it's so interesting. It was such an interesting comment, and I don't know. I think we can leave it at that.
Yeah, I think one maybe just last closing remark from me is just that ultimately founders in Europe, they tend to be so values aligned that they forget that capitalism exists, right? And capitalism ends up being the great filter, and it says, actually, no, you can't build this product that's beneficial for climate change because, unfortunately, you've not developed a product that customers want. And I think where the hope aligns, where the hope lies for me, is in aligning profitability with values. Can you build a product in a profitable way that resolves some negative externality, just to go back to what we said at the beginning? So, for example, can you build a climate positive product that actually rewards customers, saves them a bit of money? You know, um, that to me is the kind of aim that people should be working towards, and not just trying to keep their head into the sand about this stuff.
Well, I think, and on that point, I agree. What I've seen here, which is, I think there's less of a naive is not the right word, but I try to bring this perspective when I talk to other founders and other folks here sometimes, where it's like, I'm always driven to obviously very mission driven, maniacal people looking to solve a certain problem. But, you have to kind of be intellectually honest on like how humans work and how incentive structures work. And, a
Yeah,
big wave here in Europe that came was like the corporate innovation or the corporate venturing arm, right? And, a lot of these startups that are involved in their programs, or they do this or that, I'm like, don't you understand what this is? Like, you have to understand, like, they are just outsourcing their R&D. They're not,
yeah,
they're doing this to help their business, and they're going to use
yeah,
every piece of leverage over you to tie your hands behind your back. So be very careful into what you enter into. And I just think naive is not the right word, but it's,
too comfortable, I think, and maybe not cynical enough. I feel like this is
yes,
very, very typical of a culture that gets a little too comfortable, and a little, yeah, just a little too comfortable with the status quo and things being kind of perfect for a while. And it's the same reason why European governments have consistently cut down their military budgets, right? And now all of a sudden we need to have a
sure,
military, right?
sure.
Because it was convenient to forget that was ever something to be important to consider. And I think it's the same for a long time. It was the same for, um, making a profitable product. But now, VCs are starting to care a little bit more about cash flow. So, and and often that route's not even available to most people. So you have to bootstrap.
Sure. Yeah. And I think I would say that I think there needs to be a little bit more stoicism in like how, over on the European side, I think you need to be a little bit more stoic about the situation versus stoic in the way that, like, there is a reality with how humans work, how incentive structures work, and how the system works. And you're not going to bend that at your will. You're going to be able to work outside the system and accomplish what you want to accomplish by, like you said, building a great product or technology that people want and need, that's better than what's out there. It's like that simple, actually.
Yeah, it goes back to perfectionism in a sense, right? I want to build this business in the most perfect way possible. Well, you can't. Unfortunately, you're dealing with a system that is inherently capitalistic and is going to reward you for certain actions, and it's going to punish you for others. Namely, it's going to reward you for building a product that customers want. It's going to punish you for doing the opposite, as well as a
Exactly.
bunch of other incentives. So you've got to work within that system. And if you want to push your values forward, you have to do it within that system.
Yep.
And maybe that's where we'll leave it today.
That works, man. Well, thanks. That was good. It was a good little part too. I know we could have, we went off a couple of tangents there, but I think it's, these are all kind of core conversations to this, like I said, the theme of decentralization, and everything's about aligning values for people, societies, with the organizations that they build. So that's the hope, right?
Totally. And I just want to say to everyone listening that if you haven't listened to part 1, we talk about the US form of capitalism there. So if you want to go check that out, the link's in the description.
Perfect. Thanks, man. We'll see you next week.
Thanks. See you next week. Bye-bye.